Well, hello again, friends. I'm the Reverend Carla Christopher Wilson, and I'm here to talk about another incredibly important vocabulary word that we thought it would be helpful to be familiar with, and that is bias. Here's the tricky thing about bias. All of us have it. When I say to my students, "What do you dip your French fries in?" the first thing they respond with is ketchup. And when I tell them, "What? Not mayonnaise or vinegar?" the response I get back is, "Ew." But that's because they have a cultural bias that is oriented towards America, where ketchup is what we would normally dip our French fries in. We make assumptions that have to do with what is the norm of the things that we see around us. It's an easy way to categorize information and a simple way to identify with people in our communities. But where bias becomes a problem is when we start to think that the way we do things is the only way to do things, or at least the only right way to do things. Other tricky things about bias is that bias can be good or bad in terms of it can be a positive bias or a negative bias. I want to share a couple of different types of bias that we may not recognize that we even have. The first one is called the halo effect. Now, the halo effect is when we take a positive attribute and we associate it with everything around that person. For example, if we see a pastor that we trust post an article, we're more likely to believe that article than if someone who we don't like, don't know, or don't trust posts that same article. We may not ask questions as deeply as we should. We may not check things like facts or dates of that article. We simply assume it's good because the person we associated it with is good. You can see how that could be dangerous. Another type of bias is called the affinity bias. That's favoring people who share the same social background or who look and sound like one of us. When we're in a room that has lots of different religions or spiritual paths in it, we might feel more inclined to be excited to find another Lutheran. We might be excited to find another American in an international crowd, someone who speaks English in a room where people speak many different languages. That affinity that we instantly feel with them is because we share a trait or something in common that makes us feel more comfortable. But again, it can too easily become an our way is better than the other way, and that this small group that has a shared affinity, we now have to care for, protect, and defend each other, even against some of our better judgment. I'm sure you can see how that affinity bias could become dangerous too. There's another type of bias called the confirmation bias. That's noticing or only looking for evidence that confirms what we already believe. This is another one that has been a challenge to the church. We all have our own interpretations of what the Bible means and how it should be read. And quite frankly, the Bible can be used if we are taking individual verses or sections out without looking at historical context or where they were written or who they were written for. And we can use the Bible to prove or to support just about any viewpoint. That's part of what makes Lutheran scholarship so magnificent. The way that we want to understand who was it written for, when was it written, where and why was it written. If we can use that same type of scholarship that we use for biblical interpretation that's contextually influenced around our own beliefs, we can do much better decision making than if we're practicing, again, that confirmation bias. Another is called the social comparison bias. That's having feelings of dislike or competitiveness with someone or with groups of people who are seen as socially or mentally better than we are. Now, again, this doesn't mean that we agree with that, but if we feel like society views certain individuals as being better than we are, we might feel a sense of competition or a need to compare ourselves with them. setting ourselves up as against each other, as opposed to part of each other. People that are able to work together with skills and talents that can be complementary. It's another form of bias that is important to watch for in ourselves. Another, stereotype threat. Fearing being viewed through the lens of a negative stereotype and not wanting to do something to confirm it. That's something that can be a very strong challenge for Christians. We see Christians who are practicing a type of spirituality that we do not want to be associated with. And so we lean to the opposite extreme, or we feel the need to become extra defensive, and it makes it hard for us to listen to an opposing viewpoint. We're so convinced that we need to prove that we're not this negative thing. It can really block conversation. We make lots of assumptions about what type of Christian, what type of believer someone might be. This is also something that is a struggle in minority or traditionally marginalized communities. We can often be afraid to express ourselves or be ourselves because we are so afraid of making one wrong step or one wrong action that will cause whoever we're speaking to assume that we are part of that negative stereotype from that group. We don't want to confirm the bias that a person may hold that's negative and will make them dismiss us. But what that means is that we bring a lot less of our authentic selves into the conversation. If we could all be a little less afraid of what someone else's bias might make them do, we could be a lot more genuine and authentic in our conversation. The final one I want to share is gender bias, and that's a preference or a prejudice towards one gender over another. Now, this is challenging because in different cultures, gender roles are very different. And it may be very tempting for us to make an assumption about another culture and say they do or don't respect women because of the way that women dress, women speak. We may make assumptions about what gender pronouns people might use because we assume that how a certain person dresses or speaks or carries themselves should indicate their gender and change how we should treat them. Even more than 50 years after women have been ordained in the church, we still see in many Lutheran congregations people that will look at a woman pastor and be more concerned with her makeup, hair, or clothing choices than her preaching ability, or who will say things to her like, "You don't look like a pastor." So why are we discussing gender in racial justice? Because the importance of confronting bias and the fact that it intersects between our religion and spirituality, our culture, status of immigration, ability, gender, sexual orientation, all of these things are ways that we too often separate and divide ourselves, pit one group against another, or make assumptions based on our own normal, thinking that's the way everyone else should be. And bias, while natural and while something absolutely each one of us has, is definitely something that we need to work very hard to unpack. So how can we do that? Well, a few easy ways to manage bias is first to recognize that we all have it. Whether it's something as simple as thinking that jelly goes with peanut butter, we make assumptions, and that's okay. It just means we need to be on the lookout for them. So try not to be too hard for yourself. The emotional impact of stress can make reverting to a bias actually more likely. Just try to stop and think. If you find yourself making an assumption, try to mistrust your first impressions of people or situations. Ask yourself, do I have evidence to back that up? Am I making an assumption about an individual or an entire group of individuals? And is it based on lived experience? Is it based on one example of experience, assumption about feelings? Ask yourself those first impression questions before making decisions. Another is trying not to minimize differences. We don't have to say we're all the same, that we don't see color, that it doesn't matter where we come from, because it does. What color our skin is very deeply affecting on how we're treated in America. It does make a difference in who we are and how we live and what our cultural norms may be. But just because we're different doesn't mean that we're not all equally as precious and loved by God. So recognizing our differences and then actively seeking ways to celebrate them is a wonderful way to combat bias. Another is challenging negative assumptions and stereotypes. If you hear them, if you see them being practiced, lovingly, gracefully, prayerfully, but fearlessly and bravely, leap into that conversation and ask the question, well, why would you assume that? Why do you believe that? What is the evidence behind that? And maybe just helping check another person to ask those questions themselves might support interrupting a bias that could turn dangerous or sad. Another is seeking positive examples and role models from other points of view. If you recognize in yourself examples of bias, then perhaps it's because your own personal experiences are coming from a very small region. Are there ways that you can expose yourself to contrary visions? If you have had a negative experience with a person of African descent, can you seek positive examples of people of African descent? If you had a challenging experience visiting another country, can you read some travel blogs or watch some foreign films that will help you have a positive association with that same thing? We can teach and train ourselves into different forms of belief. Just because we have a natural bias doesn't mean that we have to keep it. Thanks so much for joining me in this portion of our vocabulary training, and a special thanks to theologian student Rivkah Gamble, who helped put together this information and for giving us the permission to use it today. Appreciate you, Rivkah, and appreciate all of you.